What's up guys, as promised I'm back with a follow-up video on this DIY home surveillance PC that I built a few weeks back. It's basically perfect, there are no problems with it. It's the ideal solution for anyone who wants to set up their own home surveillance system. I'm just kidding, it sucked in a variety of ways. I actually had to make a list just in order to be able to reply to all of the things, so I'm gonna do that, but long story short, I'm an idiot.
Excellent!
Cooler Master's new MM710 and MM711 gaming mice are designed to be fast, lightweight, and accurate. Both are available in black or white, glossy or matte, and the MM711 is equipped with RGB lighting, whereas the MM710 takes a more stealthy approach. Thanks to the durable yet flexible ultra-weave cable, this mouse weighs in at less than 53 grams overall and features a 16,000 dpi PixArt sensor and genuine Omron switches. The MM710 and MM711 are dust and splash resistant too, so click the sponsor link in the description to learn more.
So I'm sure this video is going to be filled with excuses, but I'm going to try to take responsibility where I can for the things that I might have done wrong with the initial assembly of this system. My first excuse, though, is going to be to blame Linus, who I've worked with in a few different projects recently. And I've always sort of admired his ability to get sort of half of a plan in mind and then be like, all right, screw it, let's just go. Let's plow ahead, let's move forward. And that's kind of what I did with this build, which might be why there were so many oversights in the original video. And the first big screw up, which was pointed out by a bunch of people in the comments, and I actually received an email from Dr. Zaber directly as well, is the power supply. You might notice, no fan on this side. Fan's on the other side of the power supply, right up against this solid metal piece, allowing zero airflow. I installed the power supply upside down. I should know better, I've built in this case before. This was just completely a brain fart on my part, so I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm gonna fix that in just a second, but first, let's go over the rest of the things I messed up. If you guys watched the first video, you saw me attempt to install multiple CPU coolers in this build before realizing that several of them didn't fit, that I didn't have an AM4 bracket for the Noctua cooler I wanted to use, and there were a couple additional things that were pointed out too. For example, the Wraith coolers, both the Spire and the Stealth, have a top plastic cap on them. Basically, you just have to pry around the outside, you can pop it off. That gives you a little bit more clearance for the fan on top. This thing is purely aesthetic. Knowing that with the Wraith Stealth might have solved my problem early on, but nevertheless, I plowed ahead with the Noctua coolers. I brought up the Noctua NHU12S, when in fact what I meant to talk about was the Noctua NHU12A. The A is the newer and better one, but that one's not currently available in the Chromax Black finish. Leon Adams pointed that out to me, so apologies to Leon, and Max Randell pointed out, along with a few others, that the plastic ring on this cooler can detach. Beyond that, there are simply some other solutions for a home security system that I didn't really delve into, and this is again due to a lack of a bit more research that I could have done prior to getting into this video. Thankfully though, and if there's a little silver lining to look at here, when I post a video like this where I am hopefully admittedly plowing ahead with something with not necessarily a complete knowledge of what I'm doing, but that content is then vetted by a bunch of you guys who watch the video and then give me suggestions for how I could have done things better or differently, or maybe just with a little bit more forethought. I appreciated a bunch of comments that were made by people who had alternative sort of DIY home solutions, several of them using Raspberry Pi solutions. Jackie Koning pointed out that he's using a Raspberry Pi with FFmpeg over Wi-Fi to just copy the files directly to network attached storage. Cubetastic said he's using Raspberry Pi Zero Ws, which are less expensive ones, and then they have camera modules for Raspberry Pi units that usually only cost between $20 and $40. So one of those camera units and then Wi-Fi, and you can connect the little assembly up to your network. He is going a step further by using Motion iOS and uploading the copied video files directly to Google Drive so he can access them wherever and he doesn't have to worry about a VPN or anything like that. Another suggestion for anyone who's currently running FreeNAS was made by CumeFox, and that is to simply run ZoneMinder on FreeNAS, and you can use that to access IP security cameras. Probably the best and most thorough comment though was by I Am Soldat, and he says he works with NVRs all the time, which is network video recorders. So he had some very good suggestions, starting out with my storage solution. He says don't use NVMe, especially for recording, which I think was because NVMe drives are just simply more expensive and you don't necessarily get any more out of them. I do want to point out this is a Plextor M6E drive, which isn't NVMe. It is is PCI Express, so it's faster than a typical SATA SSD, but it didn't work. It wasn't recognized. I ended up installing, at least for now, a couple SATA SSDs that I have the operating system installed on. But that is good advice. You shouldn't be overspending for something like this, and even a SATA SSD is probably a little bit overkill depending on the speed and the quality of it. Second suggestion, which is attached to the storage comment, is that you should be using a system drive for your operating system and then a separate drive completely for writing all of your video files to. And you probably shouldn't be using an SSD for that as well, because SSDs have limited write durability for the NAND on them, and when you're dealing with a home surveillance system, you're writing video files very constantly, depending on if you're using motion detection or constant recording or anything like that. So the drives take a big hit, and you'll probably kill an SSD over time, depending on your use case scenario. His suggestion, and it actually is one that I already did have in mind, I'm being perfectly honest about that, is to grab a WD purple drive. WD makes a purple line of drives, kind of like they have the reds and the blacks and the blues and the greens. WD purple drives are specifically made for video surveillance systems where you're writing data in a specific way because you have a bunch of video feeds that all need to be recorded at the same time. So for long-term durability, they are typically the go-to drive for this type of setup. This type of setup, by the way, being an NVR, which is a network video recorder. His next suggestion is to not use USB webcams. And here is one where I'm not going to completely follow his advice, although I am going to be now using a mix between the USB webcams and the IP webcams, which I have a few of right over here. For one, if you're using a USB webcam, and this is a reason why these tend to be less expensive, you're relying on the CPU in your computer to actually do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to computing stuff and encoding the video stream. Also, when it comes to the hardware, they can be potentially less reliable. And he also mentions questions about the actual video quality, especially if you're relying on this for, evidence in case of a break-in or something like that. There is a range of quality available on USB webcams as well, so that is something to consider. I'm still going to be using USB webcams because I have a system that is capable of doing that, but if you're potentially going to build a system, if you're going to repurpose an old laptop or something like that, one of the reasons why you might invest in IP webcams is because they actually have hardware built in that's doing a lot of this stuff on the fly. ISpy is recommending using IP webcams that meet the ONVIF standard, which I hope that is the phonetic pronunciation, ONVIF, which is the Open Network Video Interface format. If you get a camera that meets that format, it will work with a wide variety of software solutions, and it will also be hardware compatible too. That also means that the IP camera is handling encoding, motion detection, and analytics, offloading that from the CPU, which is why he said that he's running like 50 camera setups on an old Core 2100, for example. And I think that makes a lot of sense for someone who's doing this for a living and who is doing installations for security purposes for a business or for somewhere where you're going to need 20, 30, or 40 plus cameras. For my purposes, I was already considering buying the IP cameras because they're better for outdoor usage in particular, and they're better at night vision. But since I do not need that many cameras in my home, and since I already have access to hardware that's capable of handling the stuff from the USB webcams, my plan is to do a mix. Using the IP cameras externally where I need that weather resistance and possibly the better image quality, and then using the USB webcams for supplemental recording where necessary, as well as recording some of the areas inside my home. And I think that pretty much summarizes my response to a lot of the comments that have come in, and a big thank you once again to those of you who did post comments. I do try to read those, and especially the critical ones. ISpy compared my last video to The Verge's PC build video, which is obviously just the harshest criticism you could possibly send my way, but I'm trying to take my own advice and respond to that by saying, all right, I obviously don't know 100% what I'm doing here. I'm going to try to do my best to make it better and hopefully make an improved video with a bit of a learning experience for you guys at home. Last thing I wanted to bring up is there were other software recommendations out there bouncing around, because there is software you can run on a system, or there are software solutions you can buy. There's hardware and software that's already put together. Software like Avigilon or Blue Iris. Avigilon in particular is what ISpy recommended. That requires, you have to pay a license per camera for that software. So probably a better solution for somebody who's doing a professional installation or something like that, or if you have the money to pay for a license per camera, that would also be okay. For my purposes, I want to still use the ContiCam software in Windows for now, but I want to be clear, I want this to be sort of an evolutionary process as I go through this, so I'm completely open to potentially doing a Linux-based solution on this. Linux plus Wine can still run ContiCam, and there's some tutorials out there for that, or even potentially one of these other solutions like Avigalon or Blue Iris. That said, I think I need to do a brief update to the hardware here. Obviously, flipping around the power supply, and then I wanted to point out to you guys, like I said, I have a couple SSDs that I've installed here. This one here is just a 256 gig drive that has the operating system on it. This is a 1 terabyte SSD that I installed temporarily to write the video files to, and then I have been thinking about placing an order for a WD Purple drive for quite some time, and I'm actually going to do that as soon as I finish this video, which I will be installing at a later date, I promise. But that is what I'm going to be using this upper area here in this case for, because usually you'd put a graphics card here. I don't need a graphics card for this build, so I think that would make a good spot for my storage. Okay, the hardware fixes are hopefully fixed. Power supply is placed in the right way, and I went ahead and did a proof of concept with the hard drive that I'm not going to leave in here, but I wanted to make sure I could fit a 3.5-inch drive in the top here and also have it screwed in through the back so it could be relatively secure. I think when I redo this with the actual WD Purple drive, I'm going to put some silicone washers in between these screws and the drive itself to reduce some noise, vibration, that kind of thing. And then when I first installed this drive, I had it kind of vertically because I thought that looked better, and then I realized it doesn't matter what it looks like, so I rotated it this way so you could actually access the power and data plugs, even though it's screwed in and mounted to the side of the case. Speaking of the side of the case, these perforations here I do not believe are made to specifically line up with hard drives or SSDs. That said, they lined up well enough. I was able to get 4 screws through for the 3.5-inch drive. SSD is only mounted with 2 screws, but that's plenty for a lightweight drive that doesn't have any moving parts inside. All that said, now that I know this is going to fit, I'm going to remove the 3.5-inch drive and pop this back in. This is actually the 500 gig SSD I'm using temporarily. This is a 250 gig SSD, which has the operating system on it. But then we'll be able to move into the testing phase. And again, I'm not going to be showing you my drops or anything like that where I'm installing these cameras. I'm basically going to set it up all here on the table with the cameras pointed wherever so we can make sure everything is functional. Going to be plugging in probably about 4 of the USB cameras that I have available, and I have a variety of those. And then lastly, we have these, my IP cameras, which are actually security cameras. These are sourced from Monoprice, and full disclosure here, my wife works for Monoprice. I did not buy these because I did a thorough web search and they're the best rated or anything like that. I bought them because I got the employee discount. That's hard to pass up sometimes, so don't accept this as an endorsement or anything. It's purely me, just as with the rest of this build, trying to take advantage of what I've currently got rather than going out and finding Ubiquiti to be like, hey, send me a camera system or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, Kyle. All right, so we're ready to move on to the next stage, and that is to actually get these cameras connected up and tested. Now, the USB cameras, I already kind of showed you guys in part 1. For those, I'm just using little USB hubs and connecting up the cameras. Since I'm only planning to connect maybe 4 or 5 cameras for now, I actually do have enough USB plugs on the case itself to plug directly in, so I may not need the hubs. My actual security cameras here, and I've got a couple of the bullet style ones and a couple of the turret style ones, require power over Ethernet. And part of the reason why I went with cameras like these, apart from the knowledge that I now have that they do some processing internally, which does offload some of the processing from the processor in your computer, is that these are power over Ethernet. Now, I was pretty fascinated with some of those Raspberry Pi solutions that people were suggesting in the comments from the last video, and I thought about doing that briefly, but you still need to wire power to those devices in order to keep them powered at all times. And with power over Ethernet, you can have power and data in a single cable going to your IP camera, as long as you have a switch that has PoE ports on it. And for that, I got this 8 port. It's actually 8 plus 1 for your connection back to the computer. PoE switch. This is just a fast switch, so 10100, but since all we're connecting up to each port is a security camera, 100 megabits per second is totally more than enough, actually. All right, guys, some time has passed because I have had to do some research, and honestly, I've been learning a lot. I am more knowledgeable now than I was just a few seconds ago in this video, but long story short, I have good news. The IP cameras are working connected to the system. I've got picture and stuff like that. I've also been dabbling with some different software solutions, so I'm just gonna walk you through the setup I have going on right now, and then what I've been trying and the results. So let's start with the hardware setup over here, and I'm mainly concentrating on IP cameras, but I do have one of the USB cameras plugged into that just because I wanted to test them side by side. Now for networking, since the motherboard has a single gigabit NIC, that is actually going to be connected up to the switch that I got, the PoE switch, so that's going to be kind of its own separate private wired network. And that makes me feel a little bit better about having potentially internet connected capable cameras connected up to a network, because it's going to be in a separate network that's private. I do still have the Wi-Fi access, so I connected up the antenna for that. So that is connecting this system to my home network so I can access it from other computers on the system, or ideally access it remotely in the future. So our wired NIC goes over to this wired port on here, and there's a single non-PoE port directly for that. And then we've got 8 PoE powered ports, and I've just been plugging in cables to them. Just been using Cat5e cable. When I do the runs to actually mount these cameras, especially the outdoor ones, I'm going to get a big spool of like 1,000 foot of probably Cat6 cable or something like that. And different cable is meant for different purposes. For more professional installations, from my understanding, you need a riser cable, or even beyond that, plenum cable apparently, but I'm probably not going to go that far. Although, as mentioned, my wife works at Monoprice, and I'm not vouching for these cameras. More on that in just a second, but they do. But I will say Monoprice is somewhat known for their cabling and stuff, so I do have good access to that. And I've already grabbed a crimping tool so that I can put the end caps on them and run cables to the proper length for what they should be. Because even though technically for PoE support for the cabling, all you need is Cat5e or better, there are some other standards for installation in more serious environments that you should pay attention to, because stuff like the rated temperature rating and shielding is something that you should pay attention to, again, depending on where you're actually placing your cameras. That said, I got 3 of these wired up directly, and they're just kind of sitting out here on the table so I can point them at something and move around in front of them if I want to try the motion detection out. The step after that is, of course, accessing these cameras from a computer that you have connected to the network that the cameras are on. Now, probably the easy way to do this, if you've purchased cameras that meet the OnVIF standard, is to get the OnVIF device manager, which you can download from SourceForge, and that will simply go out on the network and find those devices that are on there. But if you don't know of that yet, or you're just trying to figure things out on your own, you might go to the website, which is what I did. I went to the Monoprice website, and I was like, maybe they have a download page for software or something like that. No, they do not. So I was like, well, they did ship with that little CD, so I can try to access it off of that. This is just a burned CD, by the way, nothing too special about it. I even have an external USB connected like slot loading drive, which for some reason I was really paranoid about putting this in because it's a smaller size. I'm pretty sure that still works. Let me try it. I mean, what's the worst that can happen, right? Did that work? Oh my gosh, it totally worked. All right, so I ended up doing a very convoluted way of getting the files off of this CD, but apparently I totally should have just plugged in this drive and popped it in. Instead, I used my AC to Molex power adapter to plug in an internal 5¼ inch optical drive. I had to use a Molex to SATA adapter on the end of it, and then just a SATA cable to connect it up to my HTPC, because that was one of the only systems that was up and running that had externally accessible SATA ports. Long story short, I was able to pull these files off of the drive in order to run one of these programs, but I'm also kind of stupid because, hey, I have a laptop that has an optical drive too. Anyway, just feeling silly, so I thought I'd share that with you guys. The software that I used off of that disk, though, is called IP Portal, and basically these are IP cameras, so you need to know their IP address typically in order to connect them up to software to access the camera's video feed over your network. The 3 cameras I have connected have IP addresses assigned on this little separate wired private network, but I had to set that up manually, so I'm going to plug in the 4th camera and I will show you you how I did that. These cameras have two plugs. One is the Ethernet plug. The other is, if you don't have PoE, that's for a power plug. I do have PoE, so I'm just going to plug this cable in right here. And the satisfying thing about the PoE once you have it going is as soon as you plug it in, you'll start to see some lights on the camera as it boots itself up. And at this point, I just hit refresh on the software until it appears, which might take a minute or two. And there we go, it showed up, but you might note that it is inactive. Anytime you connect a completely new camera to your setup, you're gonna need to activate it. So opening up this little sidebar, you just basically need to punch in a new password and then it will activate. And once it's activated, you can also set up some security questions in case you ever need to get back into it if you forget your password. Now at this point, you'll have some automatic setup stuff that will happen, like an automatic IP address that pops into place. What I found worked best for me is to enable DHCP, which will automatically do some network setup. Oh, you do have to punch in your password every time you modify something. And then just wait a second for DHCP to go ahead and populate the IP address and everything. Cool, but then the other thing I did, just because it seemed to work for me, was then to disable DHCP, use the settings they have, but to punch in my own fixed IP address. And that's because if you use DHCP, the IP addresses can change, and the software might be accessing the camera based on the IP address, so you don't want it to change. One of the interesting things about these IP cameras is kind of like your router, they have a built-in web interface. So if you know their IP address, you can access that to do some function changes and just make sure settings are what they should be. So here I just took the IP address that I just assigned to that camera and I punched it into the web browser. And now we can sign into that camera with the username and password that we just did. The username is admin, by the way, and the password that you created. And these cameras are apparently OEM'd through Platinum. They're Platinum cameras. Logging into the camera, I'm actually just immediately seeing a feed from it, so that's cool, but more importantly, you can go over to the configuration tab here, and you can access a bunch of stuff like system settings, maintenance if you want to update the firmware. And a lot of these cameras have security kind of built into them. These have SD card readers, for example, so you can set up event logging and all that kind of stuff directly in the camera. One thing I found interesting over on the network settings is you can see like the IP stuff that was just set up using that other little piece of software, but you can also go over to the ports, and here's where you can tell which ports you want to plug in depending on what type of feed you're looking for, and incidentally, I am going for RTSP. So at this point, the cameras are connected to the network. I can access them from the surveillance PC. I can adjust their settings. What's needed is some software on this system to be accessing the cameras and handling motion detection, storing all the video, and then giving me some sort of interface to access it in the future. And the plan this entire time has been to go with ContiCam. That said, right now the system is idling at about 31 degrees Celsius. I can hear the CPU fan, but it's not too terribly loud. It is right up against the side with nothing to block it, so there's really no noise mitigation there at all. I'm just gonna fire up ContiCam though. I'm not sure if you guys can tell from my mic, but the system is getting a little bit louder. So you might notice, for example, well, a second ago it opened up and all three feeds were going. Right now it's having issues connecting to one of the middle cameras. Oh, there it is. They're all there, but as I jump around between them, there is definitely a bit of lag here and there. And if I pop over to Hardware Info 64, I can kind of start to tell why. ContiCam buffers in the memory, so even though there's a lot of overhead being reduced by the IP cameras, we're still hitting 99% physical memory usage. Remember, this is an APU, so even though I have 8 gigs of memory installed, there's actually only about 6 gigs accessible. I also noticed CPU usage spiking up a lot. It's hit 86.3% max, and it's fluctuating between maybe 50 and 70% on average. And so, of course, temperatures have also gone up, hitting, well, 67 degrees max. Oh, it revved up again just now, but it was also just sort of generally running between 58 to 62 or so, which is maybe a little bit warmer than I'd want for a system that's going to be running 24/7. And then if that means that the fan is going to be super loud at the same time, well, that kind of detracts from, I'd say, the overall long-term usability of this existing setup. My next step was to try out some different software, because another one that I had seen recommended pretty frequently, which is also freeware, so free to use, and then you can pay for sort of some upgrades and some other access to other features, is a program called ISpy. So that's what I tried out next. Actually, before we try ISpy, I was going to try to add that camera that we just connected, the fourth one. You do it by IP address, and again, the nice thing about doing it static is you know which one is which, so I just added 202. Then you can choose your standard for if you have a specific brand of camera, which might improve things as well. I'm just using the generic Honorific RTSP standard, and the username and password's already input, so hopefully it can pull up the feed. Oh look, it worked. And here's where I could probably fix some things up when it comes to the system usage and running hot and being a little choppy and everything. This is where you actually tell it whether to do motion detection or continuous recording and how long to save the summaries and other things like language and other details. Another nice feature of ContaCam, although I haven't tried it out personally, but I've seen a lot of people saying it's really nice, is you can have it email you when the camera fails, which if it's behaving like these cameras that I'm just plugging in, I would be getting lots of emails. So I do have all 4 camera feeds up and running now, although one of them has immediately switched to cannot connect. And I want to point out once again that physical memory usage spiked up to 99.9%, and temperatures are again just a little warmer than I would like them to be. So here is ISpy, and I currently have 4 cameras connected. Keep in mind the 3 on the right here are the IP cameras. The one on the left here is the webcam that I just kind of added late in the game. Some cool features I notice about this right off the bat is if I'm moving, you see the blue bars going across the bottom. That's sort of saying like how much motion, I believe, or difference from frame to frame is detected on each one, and it keeps that up to date pretty quickly. It's running all the cameras about 10 frames per second, which is probably also helping keeping system overhead down a little bit. And then you can also see the motion detection happening up in the right corner of each frame. There is a little red dot that is red if it's recording, or if I freeze and stop moving. It's vision's based on movement. There, it stopped recording. So we do have 4 cameras up and running right now, and the physical memory usage is staying way, way, way less than we were getting with ContaCam. So I think that's one big benefit so far. One of the things I was noticing with ContaCam because of that memory buffering issue is the cameras were getting really out of sync. Even though the time code on them was the same, some of them were delayed much more than others, so I imagine that might be a point of concern. Also though, just generally speaking, I think temps are staying a little bit lower. Not like super, super low, but we're hovering in the mid to upper 40s rather than the mid to upper 50s, and spiking even higher than that. It's only gotten up to 58.8 max so far. And then another cool thing about this software is if you go up to add, you have the option to just add an Honorific camera. So with this, assuming you have your camera set up already and activated, just choose the IP address that you've assigned to it. You gotta put in your password, of course. Hit next and you'll see access to a couple feeds. I'm not showing you that because the password's kind of integrated into that string, but then we just want to choose the higher resolution one and hit OK. And here again are a bunch of different settings you can do for each camera, like naming the camera what it should be, motion detection, alerts, cloud storage, and of course regular storage, and I'm switching all my regular storage over to my D drive. And a couple seconds later, the camera has popped up on screen. And another nice thing that I like about this software is they have several layout options. You can go to optimized and it'll just kind of put everything up there side by side for you. And even with that last camera added, our memory usage still hasn't gone up over 33% or so. Temperatures are still, again, just a little on the high side, which, I mean, this isn't like a horrible temperature to be running at, but if that's what it's doing 24/7, then I'm a little bit concerned. And again, the noise is something that I don't want to have to deal with because this is going to be in our computer room. All right, so I plugged in the rest of my USB cameras, at least the ones that have cables I can plug in. Fortunately, ISpy also works with the USB cameras. Just want to add a local camera, and then, oh look, there they all are, the 4 that I added. I hope it's able to differentiate between those 2 HD USB cameras because those are pretty generic. And here I am going to try to go at a higher resolution if possible. All right, added the Logitech C920 there. Let's go ahead and make our view more reasonable. And there it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cameras, 4 IP PoE cameras, and 4 webcams, all connected to the same setup, doing motion capture recording when they feel like it's necessary. Files are currently being saved on the storage drive until I get that WD Purple drive installed, and it's all here. The video, each camera gets a different name, and then it saves it in a separate folder. Meanwhile, system resource-wise, we have not gone over 41.4% maximum memory usage. That's awesome. CPU usage has topped out at 59.5%, which is again significantly lower by about 20 or 30% than what we were getting with ContiCam. And then here's our current CPU temperature, 55.4 degrees, and this is probably the thing that's making me think I should figure out a different cooling solution. Okay, hold on. I have a couple quick things to add before this video actually ends, and if you can't tell, I come from the future, because obviously I have a longer beard now. Long story short, after a bit more tinkering around and testing, it's not really the software's fault that I was dealing with higher system usage using ContiCam than I was with ISpy. I have a lot more trial and error to do to get this system set up perfectly, but it kind of boils down to this. The IP cameras need to be set up specifically within the camera itself, and then just be sending a video feed to the NVR. These cameras are intelligent enough to handle stuff like motion detection and a lot of other features as well, and those can be set up within the camera, and that takes a lot of the overhead away from the PC, and that is how a lot of people are saying that they have 20, 30 plus cameras connected to one NVR. If all the NVR is doing is taking a video feed and writing it to disk, you will have minimal CPU usage. So I'm still going to be doing one more follow-up video where I give you guys what is hopefully my final solution for this, where I tweak stuff. I might do some modifications and upgrades to the system itself. I'll definitely be doing some cable runs with some actual Ethernet cable that I set up myself too. And the reason I think I'm kind of leaning back towards ContiCam now that I've figured out it's more about the camera configuration for reducing system usage than just what software you're using is ContiCam has a $10 one-time fee, whereas ISpy requires a monthly fee, and I'm trying to do this on the cheap if possible. So thank you guys so much for bearing with me as I sort of trial and error my way through this and figure stuff out as I go, and my final video will hopefully be presented as a here is my home security system that I DIY'd, here's how you could do it yourself with all the settings and details and everything that's required. Fingers crossed. Thanks again for watching, guys. Hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this one. We'll see you next time. And buy a hoodie, huh? Maybe a hoodie.